Hello, Lighthouse. Pastor Jason here. Welcome to another edition of Truth for Troubled Times. Recently, ESPN showed a 10-part documentary on Michael Jordan's last season with the Chicago Bulls titled The Last Dance. Being a huge MJ fan, I soaked it all in and truly gained a greater appreciation for who this man is. What became quite apparent was his relentless drive, his hyper-competitiveness, his win-at-all-cost attitude, which yes, led to many championships and MVPs, but also led to some difficult and broken relationships, to having teammates that respected but not necessarily loved him, and a sense of bitterness and longing as he faces the effects of aging. Before this, I knew mostly MJ the highlights, but after 10 hours of personal interviews of him and dozens of those close to him, I was starting to know a bit more of the real Michael Jordan. Are we sometimes that way with God? We know the highlights, we can list his great works, his divine attributes, yet do we truly know him? In the midst of this series on drawing near to God, I want to encourage you today to think deeply. Paul counsels Timothy in 2 Timothy 2:7, "Think over what I say, for the Lord will give you understanding in everything." When we have a shallow view of God, then we have a shallow faith. But when we have a deep view of God, we have a deep faith that draws us ever nearer to him. I think most of us can list many of the attributes of God. Some seem fairly straightforward. He is good, just, merciful, patient, loving. Other attributes may be a bit trickier to wrap our head around. He's holy, he's immanent, he's transcendent. And the list goes on. My challenge to you is to pick one attribute at a time and just dwell on that for a day, a week, maybe longer. Study it. Find biblical verses that help explain and clarify. Get to know the real God. One attribute that we've been talking a lot about during this COVID-19 season is his sovereignty. Any youth group kid could tell us that means God is in control. He's in control of everything, even this season of coronavirus. But what does it really mean that he's in control? Does it mean he's kind of watching over the universe and when something goes astray, he steps in to make sure everything works out okay? Was he busy with something else when the coronavirus got out? This is like the famous hurricane question that generations of pastors and theologians have wrestled with. Does God cause hurricanes or does he allow them to happen? Is his sovereignty one that is more reactive or proactive? As you look to scripture and think more about how does God's sovereignty work, you'll inevitably come to Genesis 50:20, which we've looked at in an earlier devotional. Joseph is talking to his brothers who so mistreated him. And he says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." In God's sovereignty, he was able to work these terrible deeds for the good. But one word might cause you to think more deeply. The word meant. God meant it for good. God meant the brothers' evil for good. God planned for this to happen to Joseph so that he would eventually be humbled of his pride and save his family. Just like God meant for this season of stay-at-home and COVID-19 to happen. Hurricanes and pandemics only happen if God allows them. And here's the thing, when you think deeply on God, it's like sucking on a hard candy. It's hard and tough at first, maybe even a bit sour. How could God mean for something like this to happen? If God is truly loving, how come bad things are happening to good people? If God is just, how come so many people get away with things? But as we really chew on this, as we wrestle with it in our minds, think through all the whys and how comes, we get to the middle of the candy, the sweet center that is our awesome God. We may never fully understand the problem of evil or why he chose me or how my free will actually works, but we will see and know the sweetness of God who loves us, who is for us, who will never let go of us. We get to know the real God. When I think more on this idea that God meant for this season, I realize that God doesn't take pleasure in our being apart, in our suffering, in illness, but he has eternity in mind. God's sovereignty means that he can coordinate and orchestrate every event in my life, every interaction, every decision, as well as the butterfly effect of every other person's actions on this planet, and every natural event, every molecule, past, present, and future, for my eternal good, while doing the exact same thing for every other believer, and somehow it all works out. The sweetness of God. So, beloved, ponder, dwell, meditate. We will never fully wrap our minds around an infinite God, and the knowledge of him is inexhaustible. Yet, we can draw nearer every day as we think deeply on him. God bless.